Omar Varek did not warn them. He simply detonated the road beneath the convoy and watched through binoculars as American soldiers burned. Then he laughed. Not because he was angry, not because he was afraid, because he believed no one could touch him. 7 snipers surrounded his compound. 7 professional killers with rifles aimed at every direction, every approach, every angle. The American commanders looked at the map and said the same thing. Too many targets. But they hadn't met Staff Sergeant Reese Callahan yet. Before we go any further, if you're new here, hit that subscribe button right now and drop a comment telling me what city you're watching from. I want to see exactly how far this story travels. Now let's get the first thing you have to understand about Omar Varek is that he never lost sleep. Not once. Not after the first convoy, not after the second. Not after the third attack in 11 weeks that killed 9 soldiers and left a 4th vehicle burning so completely they couldn't pull the bodies until the following morning. He slept fine. He ate well. He prayed, he laughed with his men, and then he went back to the work he had decided was his calling in this world-building devices designed to tear human beings apart. That was who they were dealing with. The intelligence reports called him a bomb maker, but that title didn't fully capture what he was. A bomb maker was someone who assembled parts in a room. Omar Varek was something closer to an engineer of terror. He studied American convoy patterns. He mapped route timing. He understood shift changes and patrol rhythms better than some of the unit commanders who were responsible for them. And then he used all of that knowledge to build explosives that were almost impossible to detect until it was already too late. By the time the 3rd convoy hit his device, the death toll was 23. 23 American service members. 23 families. And Varek was still alive, still moving, still laughing, somewhere inside those mountains. That was the thing about the Afghan highlands that broke down people who had never operated there. The mountains didn't just provide cover, they created a world that ran on completely different rules. Sound bounced in unexpected directions. Wind changed without warning. Distances that looked short on satellite imagery turned into hours of brutal movement on the ground. And for someone like Varek, who had spent years learning every ridge and hollow in those mountains, the terrain was less an obstacle than a partner. He had built his compound into the side of a slope that created natural choke points on every approach. The valley below was the only viable route for a large team, which meant it was the first place he had prepared for. The secondary approach through the eastern ridge added significant time and exposed any team to observation for nearly 40 minutes. The northern approach was almost entirely exposed once you cleared the first tree line. 7 sniper positions. It wasn't a defense system. It was a sentence. Because Varek hadn't just hired bodyguards, he had recruited former military contractors, professionals, who had spent years learning exactly how American forces approached, how they thought, how they communicated, what patterns they fell into under stress. These were people who understood counter-sniper tactics from the inside because they had once practiced those same tactics themselves. When the intelligence report landed on the desk of Colonel Marcus Hale at the forward operating base, he read it 3 times. Then he called in his senior advisors and asked them to read it. Then he sat back in his chair and rubbed his eyes and said something nobody in that room had heard him say before. I don't know how to send people into this. That statement from a man who had operated in 4 different combat theaters landed like a weight nobody wanted to carry. The SEAL team assigned to the mission, 16 operators, had been briefed in pieces because even the briefers seemed reluctant to lay it all out at once. Team leader Lieutenant Commander Joel Marsh had read every page of the intelligence file by 0:30 and had come back with a question that nobody at the table could answer cleanly. What's the expected survival rate if those positions are still active when we enter the valley? The intelligence officer, a young captain named Davies, who looked like he'd been awake for 2 straight days, shuffled his papers and said, "We're modeling it at roughly 30% effectiveness for the team reaching the compound." Joel Marsh stared at him. 30% effectiveness, he repeated slowly. "Yes, sir." "That's not a mission parameter," Marsh said. "That's a body count estimate." Nobody argued with him. The room went quiet, and in that quiet, everyone was doing the same math and arriving at the same place. 16 men, 30%, which meant at a realistic projection, the team would lose more than half its operators before getting close enough to do what they came there to do. And Varek would walk away again. That was when Major Delia Whitfield, the operations officer, who had been standing near the door with her arms crossed, said the name that changed everything. There's one option we haven't fully explored. Nobody said anything. Callahan. Joel Marsh turned. You're talking about a precision shooter. One shooter. I'm talking about the best precision shooter this command has fielded in 6 years, Whitfield said. And I'm talking about a woman who has operated in conditions more difficult than this and come back with better results than teams 3 times her size. You're asking her to neutralize 7 professional shooters, Marsh said, across different positions, probably different elevations, in mountain terrain, before we move. I know what I'm asking, Whitfield said. That's not possible, someone near the back of the room said. Whitfield turned and looked at the speaker, a heavy-set logistics major, who had the expression of a man who had never personally gone into harm's way and had very strong opinions about what other people could accomplish. Then it's a good thing, Whitfield said quietly, that I'm not asking for your assessment. That was how Staff Sergeant Reese Callahan got the file. She was sitting in the makeshift rec room at FOB Mercer when her spotter, Corporal Dylan Garrett, walked in and dropped a folder on the table next to her coffee cup without saying a word. She didn't look up immediately. She was reading something, a letter from her younger sister, who had written about her daughter's first recital and included a hand-drawn picture that a 7-year-old had labeled Aunt Reese the Soldier, with a level of artistic confidence that Reese found deeply endearing. She folded the letter and looked at Dylan. He had an expression on his face she had seen exactly twice before in 3 years of working together. It was the expression he got when the information in front of him was serious enough that he had decided not to editorialize. She picked up the folder. She didn't say anything for a long time. Dylan sat down across from her and waited. That was what made him exceptional at his job. He understood when silence was the right choice. Most people confronted with heavy information filled the space with noise. Dylan let the silence do its work. Reese studied the satellite imagery. She counted the position markers. She read the notes on the contractors, their known affiliations, their professional backgrounds. She read the notes on terrain elevation wind patterns at different times of day based on historical data from the region. She read the intelligence assessment of Varek's timeline, which suggested he was preparing to move within 72 hours, which compressed everything. She set the folder down. How many people in that briefing room decided this couldn't be done? She asked. Dylan considered the question. Most of them, Bayan, he said. How many of them have ever actually looked through a scope at a human target and made a decision? Dylan looked at the ceiling, briefly. Probably 2. Reese nodded slowly. She picked up her coffee, found it had gone cold, and drank it anyway. 7 confirmed positions, she said. 7 confirmed, Dylan said. Possibly more unconfirmed. The imagery has gaps. The imagery always has gaps. This particular gap, Dylan said, is in the eastern approach, which is also where the best counter-sniper position would logically be if I were building this system. I know, Reese said. Another silence. I want to be honest with you, Dylan said, and his voice shifted slightly, not dramatically, just a fraction more careful. I'm your spotter. I go where you go. That's not in question. But I want to make sure you're building this picture with complete information. Reese looked at him directly. Tell me. These aren't militia fighters. 2 of the identified positions are occupied by people who trained at the same facilities we trained at. Same doctrine, same counter-detection protocols. They're going to expect a precision shooter response. They've probably already thought through how they would defend against exactly what we're being asked to do. Reese was quiet for a moment. Then she said, so they know someone might come for them, humor them. They'd be foolish not to expect it. Then the question isn't whether they're ready, Reese said. The question is whether they're ready for me specifically. Dylan sat with that. That's a fine line between confidence and arrogance. Reese almost smiled. Frank Bishop said the same thing to me the first week I trained under him. You know what I told him? What? I told him there's a third option between confidence and arrogance. He asked me what it was. She looked back at the folder. Accuracy. Dylan studied her face, then he picked up the satellite imagery and pulled it toward himself and started recalculating angles, because that was how they worked. She made the decision. He made it possible. It had been that way from the beginning, and neither of them would have changed it. Major Whitfield called Reese in for a formal consultation at 0600 the following morning. The room was smaller than the original briefing, just Whitfield, Marsh Davies, and a senior NCO named Sergeant Major Briggs, who had the quiet energy of someone who had seen enough to know when to stop talking and start listening. Whitfield laid out the timeline. Varek was moving in 72 hours maximum. The intelligence was perishable, which meant the window for the assault was closing, and the 7 sniper positions would be active until either the assault happened or Varek was already gone. "What do you need?" Whitfield asked. 48 hours of approach time, Reese said. "I want to be in position before the assault window opens. I don't want to be moving while they're already on alert." "You're going in a full day before the team moves?" Marsh asked. "I need observation time," Reese said. "The imagery tells me where they were when the satellite passed. It doesn't tell me their patterns, their rotations, their dead zones. That intelligence has to be built in the field." "That's a significant period to be unsupported in that terrain," Briggs said. Not a criticism, it was the kind of observation that came from genuine professional respect from someone making sure all the variables were on the table. "I've operated longer," Reese said. "Dylan and I can sustain 72 hours in concealment if necessary." Marsh was looking at her with an expression she recognized, not disbelief exactly, but the careful evaluation of a man trying to decide whether what he was seeing was real courage or dangerous overconfidence. "Let me ask you something honestly," Marsh said. 7 professional shooters, some of them trained by the same people who trained you. What makes you believe the outcome is different than what the models are suggesting?" Reese didn't answer immediately. She thought about it, which some people in that room might have read as hesitation, but which Briggs read correctly as the behavior of someone who didn't deal in rehearsed answers. "The models," she finally said, "are built on outcomes from teams, groups moving together, communicating, creating observable patterns. What they're defending against is a force. I'm not a force. I'm one person who isn't going to be where they expect me to be, and by the time they've processed what happened to the first position, I've already moved." "And if they adapt faster than you expect," Marsh pressed. "Then I adapt faster than they adapt," Reese said. "That's the only honest answer I can give you." Marsh looked at Whitfield. Something passed between them that didn't require words. "Authorization requires confirmation that you understand the risk to yourself in this scenario," Whitfield said. "We're not going to sugarcoat it." "I know the risk," Reese said. "If something goes wrong out there, the extraction window is limited. We can't compromise the main assault to recover." "I know the risk, ma'am," Reese said, and there was something in her voice, not defiance, just clarity, that made Whitfield stop mid-sentence. A moment of quiet settled over the room. Then Marsh leaned back and said, "What do you need from us?" Reese pulled out the notes she had already made. She had been building her request since she first opened the folder the night before. Routes, equipment, communication windows, rules of engagement. A small list of contingency questions about the Eastern approach and the intelligence gap Dylan had flagged. Because Reese Callahan did not walk into that room to convince anyone she was capable. She walked in to do the work. Davies answered her questions about the Eastern gap as best he could. The honest answer was that they simply didn't have reliable data on that section. A ridge feature blocked consistent satellite observation. Thermal imaging had shown some heat signatures consistent with one position, possibly 2, but the resolution wasn't definitive. "So there might be 8, Reese said. Davies shifted in his seat. "We think 7 is the confirmed number. But there might be 8. A pause. "We can't rule it out." Dylan, who was standing behind Reese and had been silent the entire briefing, said "good to know" in a voice so completely neutral that it managed to convey about 12 layers of professional frustration with intelligence gaps without technically saying anything negative. Reese didn't react to it. She just made a note. "One more question," she said, looking up at Whitfield. "The SEAL team's assault window. If I'm not done when it opens..." "They wait," Whitfield said. "How long?" Whitfield hesitated. "Within reason." Reese looked at her steadily. "Within reason means what exactly, ma'am?" Whitfield met her gaze. "It means I trust you to be done." It wasn't exactly the concrete timeline Reese would have preferred, but she understood what Whitfield was actually communicating, that the success of the entire mission was being placed in her hands, and that the operation would hold its breath until she finished. That was either the greatest vote of confidence she had ever been given, or the heaviest responsibility she had ever carried. Probably both. The night before movement, Reese sat outside her quarters and looked up at the sky for a while. She wasn't someone who performed pre-mission rituals in any dramatic way. No dramatic speeches to herself, No ceremonial sharpening of blades. None of the things that movies decided soldiers did before difficult operations. What she did was think. She went through it methodically, each position as she understood it, each variable she could control, and each one she couldn't. The wind patterns that historical data said were most likely at the elevation she would be working. The angles that would give her the best probability without exposing her position. The sequence which target first, which second and why, and what changed if the sequence broke down. She thought about the Eastern Gap. She thought about it for a long time. Dylan came and sat next to her without being asked and without saying anything. He pulled out a worn paperback that he always seemed to have in his pocket, regardless of the operating environment, and he read for a while in the dim light spilling from the doorway behind them. Eventually, he said without looking up from his book, Frank Bishop used to say, the mission starts when you decide to take it, not when the boots hit the ground. Reese looked at him. You never met Frank Bishop. You quote him enough that I feel like I did, Dylan said. She almost laughed. It came out more as a quiet exhale that carried something close to warmth. He also said something else, Reese said. He said the most dangerous moment in any mission is the one right before it starts, because that's when your mind fills with everything that could go wrong, and the only way through it is to remember why you started. Dylan looked up from his book. And why did you start? Reese looked back up at the sky. She thought about the 23 soldiers. She thought about their families. She thought about the 16 men who were going to walk down into that valley and trust that someone had cleared the way. She thought about her sister's letter about a 7-year-old who drew pictures labeled with her name and the word soldier. Same reason everybody starts, she said finally. Because someone had to. Dylan looked at her for a moment, then went back to his book. They sat there for another hour in the kind of silence that was comfortable in the way that only comes from genuine trust, from shared experience, from the specific bond of two people who had been in enough difficult situations together to know they could say anything or say nothing, and either one would be received correctly. At 0100, Reese went inside and checked her equipment one final time. Rifle ammunition, spotting equipment, communication gear, water rations, first aid, emergency protocols, everything exactly where it needed to be, everything accounted for. She thought about the 8 possible targets. She thought about the intelligence gap in the East. She thought about what Dylan had said, that the enemy counter-sniper team would have thought through exactly how to defend against someone like her. And she thought about what she had said in a response. They're ready for a precision shooter. They're not ready for me. She had said it with conviction. She had meant it with conviction. But conviction and certainty were two different things, and Reese was honest enough with herself to know the difference. What waited for her in those mountains was not a training exercise. The people she was going against were not standing targets. They would be watching. They would be ready. And at some point in the next 48 hours, at least one of them would realize something was happening. The question was whether she would be faster. She closed the last clasp on her equipment. Pax stood up and took one breath. Then Staff Sergeant Reese Callahan walked toward the door, and into the darkness and the mountains that had killed so many soldiers before her opened up and swallowed her whole. Joel Marsh watched her go from the edge of the operations center. Sergeant Major Briggs came and stood beside him. You believe she can do it? Marsh asked. Briggs watched the darkness where Reese had disappeared. I've been doing this for 22 years, Briggs said. I've met maybe 5 people in that time who made me feel, standing next to them, that the situation was actually going to be okay. He paused. She's one of them. Marsh considered that. Then he turned and walked back into the operations center because there was nothing left to do except trust that the woman moving through the darkness toward impossible terrain was everything she had shown them she was. 16 lives were already resting on that belief. And somewhere in the mountains, Omar Varek was still sleeping soundly, still confident, still completely certain that nothing could reach him inside his fortress of 7 guns in rock and darkness. He had no idea that the thing coming for everything he had built was already moving. She didn't make a sound. She never did. The mountains did not care that she had a mission. That was the first thing Reese felt when she and Dylan moved past the outer perimeter and into the open terrain beyond the wire. The mountains simply existed, massive, indifferent, brutal, and everything a human being carried into them was their own problem to solve. The cold pressed against every exposed inch of skin. The wind came in unpredictable directions. The ground shifted from solid rock to loose shale without warning, and every misplaced step was a decision that could ripple forward into consequences you wouldn't feel until it was too late. Dylan moved behind her at a practiced interval, close enough that she could signal him without sound, far enough that one bad step wouldn't take both of them. They had established this spacing years ago, not from a manual, but from experience, from the specific kind of learning that only comes from operating together in conditions where the wrong lesson could be your last one. They did not speak. They didn't need to. There was a language they had developed over 3 years of working together that existed entirely outside of words. A hand signal, a shift in body weight, a particular stillness that meant hold, or the very specific quality of a glance over one shoulder that meant I need you to see what I'm seeing right now. Most spotters and shooters develop some version of this. What Reese and Dylan had went deeper. They had been in situations where that nonverbal communication had to function under extreme stress, under fire, under conditions where adrenaline was trying to reduce every human being in the vicinity to pure instinct, and they had refined it until it was almost automatic. 48 hours. That was what Reese had asked for. That was what she had been given. She intended to use every minute of it. The first 6 hours of movement were the most demanding physically. The approach route Reese had selected was not the fastest or the most direct. It was the one that kept them in terrain features that broke their silhouette against the skyline, that kept them below the likely observation angles of the 7 confirmed positions that moved through the natural dead ground of the landscape, the way water moved through a riverbed following the path of least visibility rather than least resistance. It added time. It added distance. But it meant that if any of Varek's people were scanning at any point during their movement, Reese and Dylan would not be what they found. By the 4th hour, Dylan's breathing had changed slightly. Not dramatically, he was in excellent condition, but Reese noticed it the way she noticed everything, with the peripheral awareness that had been trained into her over years until it had become as natural as the awareness of her own heartbeat. She slowed their pace by maybe 10% without signaling it explicitly. Dylan would notice the adjustment and understand it for what it was, not hesitation, not caution, just the calibration of a long-distance effort by someone who thought in terms of performance over sustained time rather than raw speed in a given moment. Frank Bishop had taught her that too. He had a phrase he used when young shooters came in burning hot, pushing too hard in the early hours of a long evolution. "You're not racing," he would say, voice completely flat, completely without judgment. "You're hunting, and hunting requires you to still be effective when you get there. So think about what it costs you to get there fast, and whether that cost leaves you with what you need when you arrive." Reese had internalized that to the point where it wasn't thinking anymore. It was just how she operated. They reached their first planned observation hole point at hour 7. It was a position that had been identified from the satellite imagery as a location with reasonable elevation advantage over 2 of the 7 confirmed sniper positions, with a narrow angle of observation that required patience, but provided cover that was difficult to observe from the compound area. Reese settled into the position with the practiced deliberateness of someone who understood that how you arrived at a hide was as important as the hide itself. Movement at the wrong moment, at the wrong angle, at the wrong speed could produce a silhouette or a flash of reflection that traveled a very long way in mountain terrain. She was still. Completely, absolutely still. Dylan pulled up beside her, settled his own body, and began his own observation sweep. After about 4 minutes, he leaned fractionally toward her and mouthed 2 words without sound. Position 1. Reese had already found it. The first shooter was on a rock shelf about 800 meters to the northeast. He was well concealed. Whoever had set these positions up understood their craft. But well concealed was a relative term. Nothing was perfectly invisible if you gave yourself enough time and enough perspective. And Reese had been trained to find the things that weren't supposed to be findable. What she was looking for wasn't the shooter himself. It was the evidence of a human presence, the slight wrongness of a shape that didn't fit the natural pattern of the rock, the tiny absence of movement in a place where natural things move fractionally with wind, the specific quality of stillness that only a trained person actively trying to be invisible could produce. She watched. She clocked the rotation. He was disciplined, shifting his observation angle every 90 seconds or so, covering his assigned sector methodically. Former military? Definitely. The pattern had the automatic quality of something that had been drilled until it was reflexive, not learned from experience in the field. She began building her timeline. Over the next 4 hours, without moving from the hold position, Reese and Dylan between them identified 3 of the 7 confirmed positions, confirmed the rotation patterns of all 3, and began triangulating the relationship between the positions, how they overlapped, where the coverage was thinnest, and most critically, where a person in position 1 could observe position 2 and vice versa. Because mutual observation was the biggest complication in what she needed to do. If 2 positions had clear sight lines to each other, then neutralizing one position would immediately signal the other. She needed to understand the geometry before she could plan the sequence. Dylan was mapping it in pencil in a small notebook he kept against his chest. Tiny notations abbreviated to a system only the 2 of them understood. He had a mind for spatial relationships that complemented Reese's shot discipline perfectly. He could translate the 3-dimensional reality of what they were observing into a 2-dimensional problem and find the mathematical relationships between variables in a way that felt almost effortless to watch. 2 and 3 have mutual line of sight, Dylan murmured, voice barely above nothing. I see it, Reese said. You need the window between the rotation cycles. I know. Based on what I'm tracking, you have about a 40-second window. What's the distance variance between them? Dylan did the math almost before she finished asking. 11 meters vertical, roughly 230 horizontal. Wind at that angle from where you're going to need to be. He paused, ran something through his head. You're going to need to account for a right to left drift at that distance, probably 6 to 8 inches. Reese nodded slightly. 40 seconds, 2 shots, different elevations, different angles, wind drift adjusted between them. She filed it. They continued building. It was around hour 11 that Dylan shifted slightly and said with no change in his voice that would have meant anything to an outside observer, Northeast Ridge. Reese moved her observation to the Northeast Ridge. It took her a moment. Then she found it, something in the Eastern Gap. The intelligence gap that Davies had been unable to fill. The area where satellite imagery was blocked by a ridge feature. The area where thermal imaging had shown heat signatures that might have been 1 position or 2, or nothing definitive. There was something there. She watched it for a long time without drawing a conclusion. The thing about incomplete information was that it was worse than no information if you let it push you toward a premature answer. She had seen people make catastrophic decisions because they had a fragment of intelligence, and their brains, doing what human brains naturally did, had filled in the rest of the picture from assumption. She watched. I count 2, she finally said. Dylan shifted his observation. A long silence. I think you're right, he said, and his voice was still perfectly controlled, which was how she knew it was bad. Dylan only went to perfect control when the information was serious enough that normal emotional fluctuation felt like an inappropriate response. 2 positions in the gap, not 1. 7 confirmed plus 2 in the gap equaled 9 total. Not 7, 9. She processed that without any visible reaction. Inside, something shifted, not panic, not fear, in the way that people use that word casually, but a recalibration. Like a machine receiving new data and running the calculations again. She had prepared for 7. She was now looking at 9. That changed the sequence. It changed the timing. It changed the margin for error in the window she had identified between positions 2 and 3. New math, she said quietly. New math, Dylan agreed. She started building again. They stayed at the hold position for another 2 hours until they had as complete a picture as they were going to get without moving to a second observation point. Then under the absolute cover of full dark, they moved. The second observation point was higher, more exposed, and took 3 hours to reach through terrain that required them to move at a pace that would have frustrated anyone watching who didn't understand what they were doing. Every movement was managed. Every potential sound was anticipated and avoided. At one point, a section of loose rock gave way slightly under Reese's left foot, and she froze for 11 seconds before continuing long enough to determine whether the sound had traveled and whether anything in the surrounding positions had responded to it. Nothing moved. She continued. Dylan was right behind her. When they settled into the second position, they were close enough that the compound below them was no longer an abstraction on a satellite image. It was a real place with real lights and real windows, and somewhere inside it, a man was still sleeping well and still believing he was untouchable. It was now hour 18 of 48. Reese had 30 hours to finish her preparation and execute. She began running the full sequence in her mind, not for the first time. She had been running it since the briefing room, since the moment she had asked Whitfield how much time they had, and the operation had become real. But now she was running it with real data, real positions, real distances, real rotation patterns, real wind, real angles, and 9 targets instead of 7. She ran it 3 times completely before Dylan said anything. 2 positions in the gap change your exposure window for position 4, he said. I know. If either of the gap positions has a line on where you'd need to be to take position 4, I know Dylan. A brief pause. Then he said, what are you thinking? It was a genuine question, not a challenge. That was something she valued about him. He knew the difference between asking a question because you were pushing back and asking a question because you genuinely needed the information to do your job. He was asking because the answer would affect what he did next. I'm thinking the sequence has to change, she said. I need to take the gap positions first, not last. Dylan was quiet, thinking through the implications. Then, that means you're opening with your hardest shots. Yes. If either of those fails to deliver a clean result, I know. Reese, his voice dropped even further, almost nothing. If the gap positions are counter-sniper trained and based on what we're seeing, I think at least one of them is, then your first shot tells them exactly where to look. It tells them where to look, Reese said. It doesn't tell them where I am. There's a distinction there, Dylan said, but it's a narrow one. She looked at him. He was right. She knew he was right. There was a version of this sequence where taking the gap positions first was the correct tactical choice and the margin of error was sufficient. There was another version where one thing went slightly wrong and the entire second half of the mission became a reactive fight for survival that she had not planned for and was not resourced to win. That was the conversation nobody in the briefing room had wanted to have directly. Not the 7 targets, not even the 9 targets. The real question was whether there was a version of this mission where Reese Callahan did not come home and whether that answer changed anything about the decision to proceed. She already knew her answer. She had known it since she sat outside her quarters the night before departure, looking up at the sky, thinking about 23 soldiers and a 7-year-old's drawing and 16 men who were going to trust that when they stepped into that valley, someone had already made it safe for them to walk. I know the margin, she said. I'm not going to pretend it's comfortable. Dylan looked at her for a moment. Something moved across his face. Not disagreement. Something more like the kind of respect that was too serious to express in any conventional way. Okay, Mom, he said. He went back to his notebook. Then we need to rebuild the sequence from gap positions forward, and I need about 40 minutes to recalculate the approach angles from your likely firing positions to each target because the geometry changes significantly. Take what you need, Reese said. He took 35 minutes. She spent those 35 minutes watching the compound below and thinking about a man she had never met whose decisions had killed 23 people, and thinking about 16 more who were waiting for her to clear the way, and thinking about her mentor's voice saying the things he had said that still lived in her, like a second set of instincts after all these years. Frank Bishop. He was retired now, living somewhere in Tennessee as far as she knew. She hadn't spoken to him in about a year. There were things you wanted to say to people who shaped you that never quite got said, because saying them required a kind of directness about feeling that people in their profession were not naturally inclined toward. What she would have said if she had called him the night before movement was this: the things you taught me are the reason I'm still alive. And they are the reason I believe I can do what I've been asked to do, not because I'm fearless, but because you taught me to carry the fear and operate anyway. And that difference, that specific gap between feeling the weight of it and not being stopped by the weight of it, is the most important thing anyone ever taught me. She would have said that. She didn't, but she thought it, and thinking it gave her something to hold on to. Dylan looked up from his notebook. Okay, new sequence. He laid it out. She listened without interrupting, which was how she always received his work. He had done the spatial mathematics she had trusted him to do, and the sequence he presented was logical, defensible, and built around the revised geometry of 9 positions rather than 7. Gap position 1, gap position 2. Then a specific order through the 7 confirmed positions that accounted for mutual observation angles and the rotation windows they had clocked during the first observation hold. The last 3 were the ones that concerned her most: a cluster of positions on the western side, that were close enough together to potentially hear the impact of shots even if they couldn't see the point of origin. The Western cluster, she said. I know, Dylan said. If they're disciplined, which we have to assume they are, then the third shot in that cluster is going to come while they're already reacting. What's the window between reaction and response for a professional counter-sniper team? Best case, they're trained to relocate before returning fire. That takes 12 to 15 seconds minimum. Worst case, they have pre-designated return fire positions and they respond in 4 to 6 seconds from the first indicator. Reese nodded. 4 to 6 seconds, she said almost to herself. That's worst case, Dylan said. And it requires that they've pre-planned specifically for this scenario. They might have, Reese said. They might have, he agreed. Another silence, and in the silence somewhere far below them, one of the lights in the compound went out, and then another, and the structure went dark except for a single source near what the satellite imagery had identified as the main entrance. He's going to sleep, Reese said. Probably. He still thinks he's safe. Dylan looked at the dark compound for a moment. He's got 9 rifles aimed at every direction. I'd probably think I was safe too. He's not counting on the right variable, Reese said. Dylan glanced at her. She was still watching the compound. The rifles aren't the variable, she said. The people behind them are. And people have patterns. People have rotations. People have 40-second windows between coverage cycles when they're transitioning between sectors. The rifles don't create those gaps. The people do. Dylan was quiet. Then he said, Bishop again. No, Reese said. That one's mine. He almost smiled. She saw it in the periphery. She went back to watching the dark compound and building the final picture. Around hour 23, something changed. It was not dramatic. It was not something that would have registered to most people as meaningful. But Reese had been watching long enough with careful enough attention that when a pattern changed, she felt it before she consciously identified it. The gap positions. The rotation in the eastern gap had been running on a consistent 90-second cycle since the first time she had observed it. But for the last 3 cycles, the cycle time had extended. 90 seconds had become 110, then 115. The difference was not enormous, but it was a deviation, and in Reese's framework, deviations were never random. There was always a cause. Gap positions, she said quietly. Their cycle time has changed. Dylan shifted his focus immediately. He tracked the next cycle, then the one after. Then he said very carefully, they're covering a wider sector. Reese felt something move through her that wasn't quite cold but was adjacent to it. They've expanded their observation area, she said. Why would they do that? Neither of them said what both of them were thinking, because something made them think a threat might be present. Not necessarily Reese specifically, not necessarily at all. It could have been a random protocol adjustment, a command decision, a response to some other intelligence they had received. There were explanations that didn't involve her. But the correct assumption, the one that Frank Bishop would have made, and the one that kept you alive, was the worst one until you had evidence to the contrary. We assume they have been triggered, Reese said. We don't know that. We assume it, she said again, and her voice carried a finality that closed the debate without being harsh about it. Dylan accepted it. He turned a page in his notebook and said, then the timeline moves forward. How much can I pull it forward? He did the math. The assault window doesn't open for another 23 hours. You can't pull it earlier than 8 hours before the window because of the communication protocol with the SEAL team. Best you can do is position yourself for earliest possible execution, which means moving now to your primary firing position. If I move now, I'm going to be in position for 8 hours before I can execute. Yes, 8 hours in a firing position in terrain that might have active counter-sniper eyes on it. Yes. Reese said nothing for a moment. Then she said, call it in. Dylan pulled the communication equipment. Reese listened as he made contact with the operations center at FOB Mercer in clipped, coded language that conveyed the essential information without creating a transmission that an adversary's signals intelligence could use to locate them. The message was simple. The timeline was revised. They were moving to execution position early, and the SEAL team should be prepared to receive the green light at any point within the adjusted window. The acknowledgement came back in seconds. Marsh's voice. Just 3 words. Copy. Good luck. Reese heard it and felt something she couldn't have named exactly, not comfort exactly. Something more like the sensation of knowing that the people behind you were real, that you weren't alone in the dark even when you were completely alone in the dark. She began moving toward her primary firing position. The approach took 2 hours and 20 minutes and covered terrain that under normal circumstances would have taken 40 minutes. She moved in increments. She stopped and observed. She moved again. Dylan matched her pace, matched her rhythm, matched her pauses. The nonverbal language between them carried everything: when to stop, when to move, when to hold perfectly still, while the wind shifted direction and something in the middle distance did something that needed to be resolved before they continued. At one point, approximately 40 minutes from her planned position, Dylan put 2 fingers on her shoulder. She froze instantly. He came beside her and turned his head slightly to indicate direction. She tracked his gaze, found what he had found: one of the western cluster positions. The shooter had moved, not relocated entirely, that would have been visible earlier, but he was at a slightly different angle within his position, which changed his observation arc, which changed the dead ground she had been planning to use during her approach. She recalculated without moving. The adjustment was manageable. It added 20 minutes and required crossing a section of ground that was marginally more exposed. Marginally, the kind of marginally that was fine if nothing else was watching, the kind of marginally that was dangerous if the gap positions had genuinely expanded their coverage and happened to sweep across that ground at the wrong moment. This was the real texture of what she did, not the shots themselves. These decisions made in the dark under compression, with incomplete information, where every choice had a chain of consequences that extended forward in time, and you had to live inside that chain with complete awareness of what it contained. She made the adjustment. She crossed the exposed section in 94 seconds. Nothing responded. They reached the primary firing position at the beginning of hour 27. Reese settled into it with the slowness of someone who understood that the first few minutes in a new position were the most critical for establishing concealment that would last. Too much movement too quickly produced exactly the kind of pattern that counter-sniper training taught you to look for. She took her time. She found the geometry of the position with her body before she committed to it, feeling the angles, understanding how it would need to hold her for what could be many hours. Dylan settled in beside her. He set up his spotting scope with the same careful deliberateness. For a long moment, neither of them said anything. Then Dylan said very quietly, 9 targets, from one position. 9 targets, Reese confirmed. The western cluster is going to be the hardest. I know. If they respond faster than we're projecting. Dylan, he stopped. She looked at him. Her face was completely calm. Not the false calm of someone suppressing something, the real calm of someone who had processed the information, accepted the variables, and arrived at a place of genuine steadiness on the other side. I know every risk in this position, she said. I've been running it in my head for 30 hours. I've found the gaps. I've found the problems, and I've found the solutions I'm going to use when the problems appear. I am not going to pretend there isn't a version of the next 8 hours where things go wrong. But I also know, not because I'm arrogant, not because I'm on thinking clearly, I know that I am the most prepared person for exactly this situation that I have ever been in my professional life. Frank Bishop spent 7 years making me ready for something like this. And right now I need you to be my spotter and trust everything we've built together, because that's what's going to get those 16 men down that valley alive. Dylan looked at her for a long moment. His voice, when it came, was steady as she had ever heard it. Read when you are. She turned back to her rifle. She settled. And Staff Sergeant Reese Callahan became completely, absolutely still. So still that she seemed less like a person in the landscape and more like a feature of it, like something that had always been there and was simply waiting for the moment it had been placed there to serve. The mountains didn't care that she was there. But Omar Varek's 9 shooters didn't know she was either. For now, that was everything. The assault window was 8 hours away. The first target was already in her thoughts, and the silence around her was the deepest, most purposeful silence she had ever carried. The first hour in the firing position was always the hardest. Not because of the cold, though the cold was real. Not because of the discomfort, though. Holding a single position for extended periods did things to a body that took days to fully recover from. The first hour was hard because of what the mind did when the body stopped moving and there was nothing left to manage except thought. Reese had learned to work with this rather than against it. She let the thoughts come. She didn't fight them or suppress them or try to replace them with tactical calculations, because suppression used energy and fighting your own mind was a losing battle that cost you exactly the resources you needed for everything that came after. She let the thoughts come, she acknowledged them, and then she let them pass through without hooking into them. It was something close to what she imagined meditation was supposed to feel like, though she had never been a person who meditated deliberately. It was just what years of lying still in dangerous places had taught her to do with the contents of her own head. The thoughts that came in that first hour were not surprising. Her sister's letter, the 7-year-old's drawing, Aunt Reese the soldier rendered in crayon with a level of anatomical creativity that suggested the child had significant career potential in modern art. The 23 names on the report she had read 3 times at FOB Mercer. The 16 men waiting in the valley below, sleeping in shifts, running their own pre-mission preparations, trusting that when the green light came, the path would be clear. Joel Marsh's voice on the radio. 3 words. Good luck. Frank Bishop, somewhere in Tennessee, not knowing that the thing he had spent 7 years building was about to be tested in a way neither of them had ever specifically planned for. And then, with the practiced efficiency of a mind that had been trained to function at the edge of human capability, she filed the thoughts away and became the position. That was how she thought of it internally, in language she had never shared with anyone except Dylan, and even with him only once becoming the position. The moment when the self and the purpose merged completely, when everything extraneous fell away, and what remained was exactly what the situation required. No more and no less. She became the position, and she waited. Hour 27 became hour 28. Hour 28 became hour 29. Dylan tracked the target rotations beside her, updating his notebook in increments so small they were almost invisible. The communication between them during this phase was almost nothing, a fractional gesture, an occasional murmur of numbers that slotted into the calculations she was running in parallel. The gap positions continued their modified cycle. Whatever had triggered the expansion of their observation arc had not resolved. They were still running the longer rotations, still covering in a wider sector. That was not good, and Reese had accepted that it was not good, and she had built that not good thing into her sequence as a factor she would work with rather than a problem that paralyzed her. Hour 30 arrived. Dylan leaned fractionally toward her. Western cluster, middle position, shift change. Reese had already seen it, a new shooter taking over the middle position of the Western cluster. The transition took about 4 minutes, which meant a brief disruption in the coverage pattern that would not repeat for what she estimated was a 6-hour rotation cycle. She filed it. Everything was being filed. Every pattern, every timing, every small imperfection in the coverage system that the 9 shooters maintained. Because the difference between a perfect defensive system and an imperfect one was not the quality of the shooters. It was the inevitability of human limitation. Nobody maintained perfect discipline for hours on end. Nobody transitioned between positions at exactly the right moment every single time. Nobody's observation sweep was perfectly consistent in angle and speed from one cycle to the next. And in those tiny accumulated imperfections, Reese was finding her windows. 9 windows, 1 for each target. At hour 31, Dylan said something that she had been expecting him to say for the last several hours. The assault window opens in 6 hours. I know. If we're running the gap positions first, you need to execute inside the next 2 hours to give yourself enough margin for the full sequence before the team moves. I know, Dylan. A pause. Wind is sitting at 7 knots from the southwest. For the gap positions from this location that puts you at 14 inches left drift at gap 111 at gap 2, I've been running the numbers. The temperature drop since we arrived has also affected your ballistic data. Your actual drop at these distances is going to be different from the pre-mission calculations by about... Dylan. He stopped. She looked at him sideways. Are you nervous? He considered this for a moment with the careful honesty he brought to most things. I don't get nervous, he said. I get precise. She understood what he was actually saying. Precision was how Dylan managed high-stress situations. He narrowed to data to calculation, to the variables he could quantify and control, because the quantifiable and controllable was where his exceptional mind was most powerful. The nervousness existed, but it expressed itself as thoroughness rather than as outward display. The numbers are right, she told him. You've checked them. I've checked them. We're ready. 9 targets, he said quietly. 9 targets, she confirmed. From one position before anyone responds. Before anyone responds effectively, she said, there's a difference. Some of them are going to respond. What they're not going to do is respond in time to matter. Dylan looked at her. Then he looked back at his scope. Okay, he said. Tell me when. She didn't answer immediately. She went back to the position and ran the sequence one more time in her mind, not because she needed to, not because she had any doubt about the order or the angles or the windows she had built. She ran it because she was that kind of person. Because the discipline that Frank Bishop had spent 7 years instilling in her expressed itself most completely in this. She never assumed she had already done enough. There was always one more check, one more confirmation, one more honest assessment of whether what she was about to do was built on the soundest possible foundation. The sequence was right. She knew it was right. Wind check, she said. Dylan read it. Steady, 7.2 from the southwest. I'll call if it moves. Copy. Gap 1 is in your arc. She found the position, the first of the 2 gap positions in the eastern sector. The shooter she had been watching for 7 hours, whose patterns she knew well enough at this point to anticipate rather than react to. He was in his standard observation posture, sweeping his expanded sector, making the small unconscious adjustments that a trained sniper made automatically after hours in a position. She watched him complete one sweep. She watched him begin another. She understood the timing. And somewhere deep inside the machinery of everything Frank Bishop had built into her, something settled into absolute stillness. Gap 1, she said. Ready, Dylan said. She fired. The sound of the shot in the mountain environment traveled in directions that were difficult to predict. It bounced off rock surfaces, fragmented across elevation changes, arrived in different places at different times, in a way that made precise localization extremely difficult for anyone trying to find her. She had chosen this firing position partly for that reason. The acoustic environment worked in her favor. Gap position 1 went still. 1. Dylan was already on the second gap position. Gap 2 is shifting. He heard something, right edge of his sector moving. I have him, Reese said. She had him. The second shooter in the eastern gap had reacted exactly as a trained professional would, not freezing, not panicking, but moving, trying to create unpredictability. It was the right instinct. It was good training. But good training and good instinct worked on timelines, and the timeline available to the second gap shooter was not sufficient for the adjustment he was trying to make. She fired. Gap position 2 went still. 2. Dylan's voice was completely controlled, which meant everything was moving at the pace she needed it to move. Western cluster, middle position is scanning. He caught something audio, probably. Scanning left to right. He'll pass through your arc in 12 seconds, Reese said. 11, Dylan corrected. She was already there. The middle position of the western cluster swept left, right, and in the moment its scan reached the arc she needed, Reese fired. 3. And here was the first real test of the sequence. Because the western cluster's 2 remaining positions were close enough that what had just happened to the middle position was within their auditory and depending on angle visual awareness. They were going to react. The only question was how and how fast. Dylan's voice came in clean and fast. Left position of the western cluster is going to secondary cover. He's doing it right. He's not staying in place. Where is he going? Behind the rock shelf, standard counter-sniper relocation protocol. He'll be in the secondary position in approximately, I know where the secondary position is, Reese said. She had mapped it during the observation hours. It was one of the things that distinguished a professional counter-sniper position from an amateur one. A professional always had a secondary firing position, pre-identified, pre-measured, pre-integrated into their defensive plan. But a secondary firing position that had been pre-identified could also be pre-anticipated by someone who had spent enough time studying the geometry of the ground. The left position shooters arrived at his secondary exactly when the geometry said he would. Reese was already on it. 4. Wait, the position of western cluster is not moving, Dylan said, and there was something in his voice, not alarm but heightened attention. He's not relocating, he's scanning for origin. He's good, he's very good. He's not running the standard protocol. Reese absorbed that without comment. The right position shooter had broken from the expected pattern. Instead of relocating, which was what training said to do, And what every other shooter had done, he was holding position and trying to find her. It was a calculated gamble. Relocation cost time. If he could find her origin before she identified him and his position, he had a chance. He was right to try it. He was also wrong about how much time he had. Distance, she said, 640 meters. Wind drift unchanged. Angle. Dylan gave it, she found him. He was scanning methodically, professionally. He was good, genuinely good in the way that the intelligence report had warned her about and that she had taken seriously. His scan was disciplined, his movement controlled. He was thinking, not panicking. But he was looking at where a sniper would logically be, not where Reese was. Because Reese was not where a sniper would logically be. She was where the geometry of the position and 30 hours of preparation had placed her in a location that the standard counter-sniper training would not prioritize as a likely firing point. She fired before he completed his second sweep. 5. Dylan exhaled once sharp, almost not audible. Then, compound is active. I see movement in the main structure. Someone inside heard that cluster sequence. Reese processed it. The compound going active was expected. It was one of the variables she had planned for. The people inside had heard enough to know something was wrong. The question was how quickly that awareness would translate into a useful response. Position 6, she said, northeast position. He's also a non-standard response. He went prone early before the cluster sequence completed. He either anticipated this or he's had more experience than the others. He went prone, Reese said, where best estimation based on where he was before he dropped 3 feet left of his primary position. That puts him behind the rock formation, probably using it as a berm. His head is going to need to be above it by about this much to maintain observation. Dylan held up his thumb and index finger, separated by a small distance. It was a gesture that only mattered if Reese trusted his spatial estimation completely. She trusted his spatial estimation completely. She moved her aim, found the geometry, calculated where a head would be if a body was using that specific rock formation as a berm from a prone position. She waited. 3 seconds. A shape appeared exactly where Dylan had said it would be. She fired. 6. The sequence was moving faster than the enemy's ability to respond in an organized way, which was precisely what it had been designed to do. But faster did not mean without risk, and the 3 remaining positions presented the specific challenge she and Dylan had identified during the planning phase as the most dangerous section of the sequence. Positions 7, 8, and 9 were the remaining confirmed position, the original 7th confirmed position from the intelligence file, and the gap position 1 whose second shooter she had not yet identified. The complication was the mutual observation relationship between these 3 positions. They were close enough in the terrain that what happened to one was visible to the others, and professional enough that at least 2 of them would be actively hunting for her by now. 7 and 8 have a visual on each other, Dylan said, and I think they've communicated. They're coordinating something. What? They've both shifted aim to the most likely firing arcs from this general area. They're covering the high probability zones. A pause. Reese, they know someone is here. They're looking for origin. If you fire position 7 from this location, I know. The angle to 7 from here is going to require you to brain. I know Dylan. She paused. I need to move. Complete silence for 2 full seconds. If you move right now, Dylan said carefully, you're going to cross the observation arc of position 8. What's his current sweep angle? East-northeast. He'll reach your crossing window in approximately 45 seconds. How long do I need to cross? Dylan's eyes moved from the scope to the terrain between their position and the new firing point she needed to reach. He ran the numbers with the precision of someone who had done exactly this kind of calculation in the field many times before. 20 seconds, he said, but you need to start in the next 8 seconds or you won't have the window. 8 seconds. Reese had already been calculating. You hold this position, she said. Keep observing. I'll take the new position and wait for your wind call. If they spot you during the crossing, then we deal with that, she said, but they're not going to. She moved. Reese Callahan in motion under fire conditions was not something many people had witnessed from a neutral vantage point and survived to describe. What she did was not running and it was not crawling. It was something that existed between those categories and had been refined through years of exactly this kind of situation into a mode of movement that was as fast as the terrain and the threat allowed, and no faster, controlled by constant real-time assessment rather than a predetermined plan. She crossed the open section in 18 seconds. Position 8's observation suite passed through that exact ground 6 seconds after she cleared it. She settled into the new position. Her breathing was elevated not dramatically but measurably, the unavoidable physiological cost of rapid movement after extended stillness. She gave herself 4 seconds. Exactly 4. Then she began the process of settling back into the position the way you had to settle into it, with the deliberateness that precision shooting at these distances demanded. Dylan's voice came through the earpiece barely above a whisper. 7 is scanning aggressively. He knows something changed. He lost his partner on 8, and he knows it. He's looking. Is he looking at me? Not yet. He's sweeping the probable zones. He hasn't reached your new position yet because it's outside the highest probability arc. Wind. 6.8 from the southwest, marginally lighter than before. Your drift at this distance and angle is going to be about 11.5 inches left. She adjusted. She found position 7. The shooter was exactly as Dylan had described, scanning aggressively, moving through the most likely arcs, doing everything his training said to do. He was clearly experienced. He was clearly good. He was the kind of person who, in a different version of this situation, was the most dangerous person in the landscape. But he was scanning the wrong places. Not because he was careless, because the geometry of where Reese had positioned herself was outside the probability model he had been trained to apply. She was in a location that scored low on the standard counter-sniper priority ranking, not because it was a bad position, but because it required a level of terrain analysis and positional creativity that the standard training framework did not account for as a high-probability choice. She had chosen it for exactly that reason. She fired. 7. And then in the roughly 3 seconds that followed, everything that had been a controlled sequence became something faster and more demanding. Because position 9, the last remaining shooter, the one she had identified during the observation phase as potentially the most technically capable of all of them, based on the way he maintained his position and managed his equipment, had done something that Reese had considered as a worst-case possibility and had not fully resolved before execution. He had moved, not to his secondary position, not according to any of the relocation protocols she had mapped during 30-plus hours of observation. He had moved to a position she hadn't identified, a position she hadn't seen. 9, she said. Where is he? Dylan's voice was tight in a way she almost never heard it. I lost him. He moved during your repositioning. I was tracking your crossing and direction. Last known, he was northeast of his primary position. But he moved fast, Reese. He moved very fast. He anticipated something. And there it was, the thing she had told Marsh in the briefing room. The thing that was the real test of the difference between preparation and perfection. Preparation accounted for the expected. The unexpected still happened. This was the unexpected. Somewhere in the terrain between her and the compound, the 9th shooter, the most dangerous of the 9, she now believed had abandoned every predictable protocol and was actively hunting her. Not defending, not relocating to a secondary position within a pre-planned framework. Hunting. He's counter-hunting, Dylan said, arriving at the same conclusion simultaneously. He's come off defense. He's looking for us. He knows where I moved to, Reese said. He couldn't have seen you cross. He doesn't need to have seen me, she said. If he's as good as we think he is, he's calculated it. He knew someone was working the sequence. He worked backward from the shot angles of positions 7 and 8, and he found the probable new position. A pause. He might be looking at me right now. Complete silence from Dylan. Then, if he is, why hasn't he fired? It was the right question. Reese's mind was already running the answer. If position 9 had found her location, and he was as professional as his behavior suggested, there was one reason he would hold fire rather than immediately engage. He wanted to find Dylan too. One spotter eliminated with the shooter was worth more than eliminating the shooter and leaving the spotter operational. A spotter could still call in the location. A spotter could direct a second shooter if one existed. A professional counter-sniper in this situation would want to remove both threats simultaneously, which meant he was waiting for Dylan to move or reveal himself. Stay completely still, Reese said. I'm not moving. Don't even shift your scope angle. If he's watching your position, any changes. I know, Dylan said. Flat, controlled. The Dylan voice that meant he was at the edge of what he was going to be able to hold calmly. And Reese was in a position that position 9 might have calculated, and Dylan was in a position that position 9 might be watching. And the only way this resolved correctly was if she found the ninth shooter before he resolved to fire on either of them. She ran the geometry backward the same way she believed he had. If position 9 was as good as she thought, and if he had worked backward from her shot angles, he would have arrived at a probability map of where she might have moved. That map would have 2 or 3 high probability zones. He would be covering the highest probability zone while watching for movement that confirmed one of the others. She was probably in his second highest probability zone, which meant she had a window. Not a comfortable window, not a large window, but a window before he resolved his model in her direction. She needed to find him in that window. Talk me through the northeast sector, she said. Every detail you have, every position he could have moved to. Dylan began describing, and as he described, Reese built the picture. She ran the geometry. She thought about what she would do in his position, where she would go, what coverage she would want, what angle gave the best simultaneous observation of the 2 highest probability zones for a repositioned shooter. She found the answer before Dylan finished describing. Rock shelf, she said, 40 meters northeast of his primary. There's a natural notch in the rock that creates a forward observation point with lines to both high probability zones. Dylan paused his description. I can't confirm from here. I know. Reese, if you're wrong. If I'm wrong, he fires and you deal with what comes next, she said. But I'm not wrong. She looked for the notch. It took her 14 seconds to find it. 14 seconds that were among the longest she had spent in this position or any other, because somewhere out there was a professional who had possibly already identified her location and was making his own calculations about timing. She found the notch. She found the shape in it that was not quite rock. Dylan, she said very quietly, don't move. Don't respond. Just stay completely still. She adjusted for the angle, for the distance, for the wind that Dylan had last called at 6.8 from the southwest, which had not changed because she would have felt it change. She took one breath. She found the center of the shape that was not quite rock, and Staff Sergeant Reese Callahan fired the 9th shot of the sequence. The shape in the notch stopped being a problem. The valley went completely still. For a moment, a very specific, very particular kind of moment that Reese had experienced a small number of times in her life, and that she knew she would never find the right words to describe to someone who hadn't been in it. There was nothing. Just the mountain, just the cold, just the sound of her own breathing and Dylan's breathing, and the wind that didn't know or care what had just happened. Then Dylan said in a voice that was the most human she had ever heard him sound, 9. She didn't respond immediately. She ran the scan, all 9 positions, confirmed the stillness of each one. It was not perfunctory. It was necessary because her job was not almost done. Her job was done when she was certain it was done, and certainty required confirmation, and confirmation required checking. Each position, each one still. 9 for 9. 9 for 9, she said. Dylan took a breath that wasn't quite steady. She filed that away with affection rather than concern. It was the breath of someone who had held themselves at the very edge of professional control for a very long time and was now allowing exactly one moment of human response before reassembling. She understood it completely. She felt something similar moving through her, though it expressed itself as a different quality of stillness rather than as any outward release. Communication, she said. Dylan was already on it. She heard him make contact with the operations center, heard the coded language that carried the most important information of the last 8 hours, heard the acknowledgement come back almost instantly, and then after a pause heard a voice on the other end that she recognized as Joel Marsh. He said, "How many?" Dylan looked at Reese. She nodded once. 9, Dylan said into the radio. The gap positions had 2. Total 9 eliminated. The path is clear. A longer pause than she expected. Then Marsh's voice, and there was something in it that Reese didn't often hear from combat commanders. Not sentiment exactly, but the very edge of it, the place where professionalism and genuine human response occupied the same moment. Copy 9. Green light is authorized. Team is moving. Another pause. Tell her, oh, he stopped. Then tell her the team says thank you. Dylan relayed the message. Reese was already returning her attention to the valley below, watching for anything she might have missed, any variable that had not resolved the way she had calculated it would. She heard the words. She did not respond to them out loud. But somewhere inside the machinery of everything, something acknowledged them. Something that had nothing to do with tactics or sequences or 900-meter shot distances. 16 men were going into that valley. They were going in because she had done what she said she could do. That was enough. Below her, the compound sat dark and quiet, completely unaware that the defensive system it had trusted was gone. Completely unaware that the 16 men now beginning their movement had a clear path. Completely unaware that the impossible thing the commanders at FOB Mercer had said couldn't be done had already been done quietly in the dark by a woman with a rifle and 30 hours of preparation and a spotter who had held himself completely still while the ninth shooter searched for him. Reese kept watching because the mission wasn't over yet, and in the back of her mind, something she had filed away was beginning to surface. Something Davies had said into the briefing room, something about the intelligence on the sniper network, something about who had designed it and how sophisticated it was. Varek was a bomb maker. But whoever built this defense system had not been a bomb maker. Someone smarter was involved, someone who hadn't been in the compound. She filed it. First things first. The SEAL team was moving, and her job right now was to keep watching the valley and make sure nothing changed before they got there. The mountains were still. The path was open, and Staff Sergeant Reese Callahan held her position in the dark and watched over the 16 men moving toward the mission that was supposed to have been impossible until every one of them crossed into the compound perimeter alive. The 16 men moved through the valley in a formation that had been rehearsed so many times it existed in their bodies rather than their minds. Reese watched them from the elevated position, rifle still up, still scanning, still doing the job that didn't end just because the 9 positions were silent. She had told herself, and she believed it, that the valley was clear. But belief and certainty lived in different places, and her job was certainty. So she kept watching while Marsh's team crossed the open ground below and closed the distance to the compound perimeter with the controlled urgency of professionals who understood that speed and noise were enemies of each other in this kind of approach. Dylan was watching through his scope beside her, tracking secondary areas. She wasn't covering, which was how they always divided the observation work, overlapping arcs, no gaps, the same geometry of attention they applied to everything. Team is 60 meters from the outer wall, Dylan said quietly. Reese tracked the forward element. Copy. No movement from the compound, no response to the team's approach. They don't know yet, Reese said. What she meant was that the people inside the compound, whoever remained, whatever security existed beyond the 9 external positions, had not yet connected the silence from their outer ring to an active threat. In the dark at this hour, a quiet perimeter read the same as a secure one. The compound hadn't received a check-in failure from the external positions because the external positions had gone quiet in a sequence that was too fast and too spread out for any internal communication system to have registered it as an organized attack rather than a series of technical or weather-related interruptions. That window was closing. Sometime in the next few minutes, someone inside that compound was going to understand that the silence from outside wasn't normal. And when that understanding arrived, the situation inside would change very quickly. Marsh, she said into the radio. His voice came back immediately. Go. You have approximately 3 minutes before internal security realizes the perimeter is compromised. After that, expect rapid redeployment of whatever assets they have inside. A brief pause. Copy that. We're moving. She watched the team's pace increase, not to a run, because running in that kind of approach produced sound and disrupted formation integrity, but to the kind of fast, controlled movement that operators achieve through training, where speed and discipline occupied the same moment. They reached the outer wall. Reese tracked the breaching element. Dylan tracked the rear security. 40 seconds later, Marsh's voice came through the radio with the terseness of a man already inside a situation. We're in. And then the radio traffic became the rapid, clipped language of an active assault, and Reese's job shifted from executing to supporting, from being the tip of the spear to being the eye that watched the ground the team couldn't see from inside the compound walls. She tracked everything she could from her position. Movement near the secondary entrance, a light that came on in the northwest section of the structure and then went out again. The sound of the assault, not loud, not dramatic, the way it was in films, but present in ways that traveled even at this distance and elevation. It lasted 11 minutes. 11 minutes that Reese spent in absolute stillness, scanning, waiting, watching for the threat that hadn't appeared yet and might not appear at all, but that she refused to discount until the team was out of the compound and on their way to extraction. Then Marsh's voice again. "We have the package. Target is in custody." A pause, not hesitation, but the pause of someone processing something unexpected. "We also have something else. Stand by." Reese looked at Dylan. He looked back at her. Stand by from a SEAL team commander after a successful capture meant something had been found that required a decision. It wasn't a phrase used for routine situations. She waited. 3 minutes passed. 3 minutes of radio silence that stretched in the particular way that silence stretches when you're stationary and everyone you're responsible for is somewhere you can't see. Then Callahan. Marsh was using her name directly, not her rank, not her role, her name, which told her before he said another word that what he was about to tell her was not a tactical update. It was something personal in the way that information sometimes was even in professional contexts, something that landed differently because of what she had done to make this moment possible. "We've recovered documentation from the compound, a significant amount. Intelligence is going to need time to process it, but there's a preliminary read that Command wants you aware of." "Go ahead," she said. "The 9-position sniper network. It wasn't designed by Varek." Reese absorbed that. She had suspected that she had filed the thought at the end of Part 3 during the long quiet of watching the SEAL team move. The sophistication of the defensive system, the professional contractors, the counter-sniper protocols, the gap positions that weren't visible in standard satellite coverage. It was a level of operational planning that didn't match the profile of a bomb maker, however accomplished. "Who designed it?" she asked. "That's what intelligence is going to need time on," Marsh said. "But what we're seeing in the preliminary look at these documents suggests this network wasn't built for Varek. Varek was using it. The network has a different origin, a different purpose." A longer silence. Then Marsh said, "We think there's someone else, above Varek in the structure. Someone who's been running multiple operations simultaneously. The 9-position system, the bomb-making operation, possibly other things we don't have full visibility on yet." Reese looked out over the valley. 23 soldiers, a bomb maker, a 9-position sniper network too sophisticated for the bomb maker who used it. And somewhere beyond all of it, a name they didn't have yet. A face they hadn't seen, a person who had designed something professional enough that it had made a FOB commander say he didn't know how to send people into it. "Copy," she said. "Get to extraction," Marsh said. "Command is going to want a debrief from you as soon as you're back at Mercer." She acknowledged and closed the channel. Dylan had heard enough to understand the essential shape of what had been communicated. He closed his notebook, which was unusual because Dylan almost never closed his notebook until they were fully extracted, and he looked at her with a particular expression he reserved for situations that had turned out to be larger than they initially appeared. "Someone above Varek," he said. "That's what the preliminary read says." Which means the 9 positions weren't protection for Varek specifically. They were protection for the network, Reese said. Varek was a node. The positions were protecting the node. Dylan sat with that for a moment. "Then whoever designed them is still out there." "Yes," she said, "and they now know their network lost 9 shooters in," he glanced at his watch, 42 minutes. The number landed in a particular way. 42 minutes, 9 professional shooters, former military contractors, counter-sniper trained in coordinated defensive positions, all of it neutralized in 42 minutes by one person with a rifle and a spotter. It was the kind of number that if it reached the right ears would communicate something very specific about the capability that had been brought to bear against the network. It would tell whoever was above Varek that they had a new problem. Not a bomb maker problem, a precision problem. Reese filed that thought. "We need to move," she said. "Extraction window." Dylan was already breaking down his spotting position. They worked quickly, but without rushing, because the same discipline that governed entry governed exit. There was a natural post-mission adrenaline drop that affected people differently. Some became careless, loosened by the release of sustained tension. Reese and Dylan both had enough experience to know that the exit was its own risk, that the worst time to be careless was when the immediate objective was already achieved. They moved back along the exfiltration route. It should have been straightforward. It wasn't. At the 40-minute mark of their exfiltration, Dylan's footing gave way on a section of rock that had been stable during the ingress and was now treacherous from a temperature change that had created a thin, almost invisible layer of moisture on the surface. He caught himself mostly, but the catch involved a hard impact on his left leg against a rock edge, and the sound he made, a single controlled exhale of pain, told Reese exactly what she needed to know before she turned. She turned. Dylan was upright. He was moving, but the way his weight distributed on the left side told her it was bad. "How bad?" she said. "I can walk," he said. "That's not what I asked." He met her eyes. "It's bad enough that I can't match the pace we need." The extraction point was still 45 minutes away at their original pace. Bad leg pace in this terrain, in these conditions with an extraction window that didn't flex significantly. She ran the numbers without sentimentality and arrived at the same place she always arrived when the variables produced a clear answer. "Put your arm across my shoulders," she said. Dylan's expression did something complicated. He was a proud man in the specific way that people who were very good at their jobs were proud, not arrogantly, but genuinely, because competence was something he had earned through years of hard work, and he understood its value. Being carried was not something that fit easily in that framework. "Reese, Dylan, arm now." He put his arm across her shoulders. They moved. What followed was the most physically demanding 47 minutes of Reese Callahan's professional life, and she had had some demanding ones. The combined weight, the terrain, the pace they needed to maintain, the fact that she had been in a firing position for the better part of 8 hours before this, and her body was operating on reserves rather than fresh energy. None of it was ideal, and all of it was her current reality. She didn't think about how hard it was. She thought about the extraction point. She thought about the helicopter window. She thought about Dylan, who was managing his own pain with a compressed internal quality of a person who understood that expressing it would only add to the load she was already carrying, and who therefore absorbed it quietly and put as much weight on his good leg as he could at every step to give her whatever margin he could find. "You're redistributing your weight," she said at one point without looking at him. "Trying to," he said through what was clearly a clenched jaw. "You don't need to. I have you." "I know you have me," he said. "That's not the point." She understood what the point was. The point was that he was her partner, and partners carried their share, even when carrying their share was what they had available, rather than what was optimal. She didn't argue it. She just adjusted her own posture to make better use of what he was giving her and kept moving. 22 minutes from the extraction point, her radio came to life. Operations Center at FOB Mercer. Not Marsh, a different voice, the overnight duty officer. "Callahan extraction window is holding. Helicopter is on schedule. What's your status?" 15 minutes out, she said, which was optimistic by approximately 7 minutes, but was the number that she intended to make true. "Copy. Be advised, command has flagged your debrief as priority. Major Whitfield is requesting your presence within 2 hours of landing." Reese registered this and set it aside for later. "Copy." Dylan, who had heard it said without lifting his head, "Priority debrief. That's either very good or very bad." "Probably both," she said. They kept moving. The last 22 minutes produced 3 separate moments where the terrain required decisions that had no comfortable answer. A section of loose shale that had to be crossed slowly when the clock demanded fast. A downward grade that transferred most of the combined weight onto Reese's knees in a way she was going to feel for a week, in a final section of exposed ground before the extraction point that they crossed in the dark, with the awareness that they were visible in ways they hadn't been during the approach. Nothing engaged them. The extraction point appeared. The helicopter was already there, blades turning, the crew chief visible in the door, the specific quality of organized urgency around a waiting aircraft that Reese recognized immediately as the real sound of a mission ending. She brought Dylan to the door. The crew chief and a second team member reached out and took Dylan's weight with the practiced efficiency of people who had done exactly this before, easing him into the aircraft with the care that the situation required. Dylan made a sound when his leg moved in a direction it didn't want to go, and then absorbed it and got his face under control. Reese climbed in after him. The helicopter lifted. For the first 40 seconds after liftoff, nobody said anything. The crew chief was doing his job, the pilots were doing theirs, and Reese and Dylan were in the particular post-mission silence that settled over people when the last external demand had been met, and the body and mind were finally processing the gap between what had been risked and what had been achieved. Then Dylan said 9, just the number. Reese looked at him. His face was pale, partly pain, partly exhaustion, partly the specific pallor that came with sustained adrenaline finally metabolizing. But his eyes were clear, and the thing in them was something she recognized as the partner version of what she was feeling herself. 9, she confirmed. He nodded once, closed his eyes, kept them closed for the rest of the flight back to FOB Mercer. She looked out the window of the helicopter and watched the mountains recede. The mountains that had killed 23 soldiers. The mountains that had housed the defensive system designed to kill 16 more. The mountains that had spent 2 days trying to keep her and Dylan from doing what they had come there to do. They hadn't managed it. She wasn't proud of that in the way that pride was usually described. She was something quieter and more specific. The feeling of a person who had prepared for something very difficult, executed the preparation, and arrived on the other side with every person she was responsible for still alive. It was not triumph, it was more like the deep exhale of an obligation fulfilled. Omar Varek was in custody. The bomb maker who had killed 23 soldiers and planned to kill 16 more was on his way to a location where he would not be building any more devices. That was real. That was done. That couldn't be undone regardless of whatever came next. But the thing Marsh had told her from the compound sat in the back of her mind and didn't leave. Someone above Varek, someone who designed the network, someone still free. The helicopter touched down at FOB Mercer 40 minutes after liftoff. A medical team was waiting for Dylan. Someone had called ahead, which she suspected was Marsh, who had a reputation for thinking 3 steps ahead, even in the middle of an active operation. Dylan was moved to the medical bay with the efficiency of a system that worked properly, and Reese walked beside the stretcher until they reached the point where she had to stop, and she stopped, and Dylan looked back at her from the stretcher. "Go do your debrief," he said. "I'll be here." "I know you will," she said. He held her gaze for a moment. Then he said quietly enough that only she could hear it, "You carried me down a mountain." "You've covered me for 3 years," she said. "We're still not even." Something crossed his face that was the Dylan version of deep feeling, compressed, controlled, expressed in the specific quality of his stillness, rather than in any outward demonstration. Then the medical team moved him around a corner, and he was gone from her line of sight. She turned and walked toward the operations center. Major Whitfield was waiting outside it, not inside where the debrief would take place, but outside in the pre-dawn dark, which told Reese that Whitfield had specifically decided to receive her there, rather than in the formal context of the briefing room. There was something intentional about it, something that Whitfield, who was one of the most intentional people Reese had ever worked with, had decided mattered. They stood facing each other for a moment. Then Whitfield said, "How are you?" "Not good work. Not report in." "How are you?" 2 words that had more weight coming from Delia Whitfield than they might have from almost anyone else, because Whitfield was not a person who asked questions she didn't mean. Reese considered the question honestly. "Tired," she said. "My knees need about a week. Dylan's leg is..." "Dylan is being taken care of," Whitfield said. "I'm asking about you." Reese looked at her. "I'm okay," she said. And it was true in the specific way that okay meant something when the person saying it had enough self-knowledge to know the difference between being okay and performing okay. Whitfield nodded. Then after a brief pause, 9. 9, Reese said. The intelligence file said 7. The intelligence file had a gap in the eastern sector. Whitfield absorbed this. "You identified 2 additional positions during observation." "Yes, ma'am." "And you executed the full sequence after identifying 9 targets rather than the 7 you planned for." "Yes." Whitfield looked at her steadily. "In 42 minutes. Reese didn't respond to that. The number was what it was. She wasn't going to perform modesty about it or perform anything else. The 42 minutes was the result of 30 hours of preparation and 3 years of working with Dylan and 7 years of Frank Bishop and everything that had come before and after all of that. The 42 minutes was the sum of all of it. She wasn't going to pretend it was less, and she wasn't going to inflate what it meant. The debrief is waiting, Whitfield said and gestured toward the operations center door. They went inside. The room was more populated than Reese had expected. Marsh was there, back from the compound, looking like a man who had been awake for 30 hours and intended to stay awake for the foreseeable future. Sergeant Major Briggs was there, standing near the wall with his arms crossed, his face carrying the expression of someone who had made a private prediction that had been confirmed and was taking no satisfaction in being right, because the confirmation had cost too much to be satisfying. Davies was there with a new pile of documents larger than the one he'd had at the original briefing, the paper product of whatever the SEAL team had recovered from the compound. And sitting at the far end of the table was a person Reese didn't recognize. A woman in civilian clothing. Mid-50s maybe? The kind of face that gave nothing away without making a performance of giving nothing away. She had the specific stillness of someone who was accustomed to being the most attentive person in any room she occupied. Whitfield introduced her as Ms. Chen from the Defense Intelligence Agency. Ms. Chen did not extend a hand. She looked at Reese with the focused attention of someone making an assessment that mattered to her, and then she said, "I've been briefed on the sequence. I have some questions about what you observed during the 30 hours before you executed." Reese sat down. "Go ahead," she said. What followed was not a traditional after-action debrief. It was something more pointed, more specific, and more significant than Reese had anticipated from the initial description of a priority debrief. Ms. Chen was not interested in the tactical execution. She was interested in the observation phase, in the specific details of what the 9-position network had looked like from the inside, how the shooters had communicated, what equipment signatures Dylan had identified, and most specifically whether Reese had observed anything during the 30 hours that didn't fit the standard profile of a contractor staff defensive position. Reese answered everything accurately and completely, which was the only way she operated. It was at the 40-minute mark of the debrief that Ms. Chen placed a photograph on the table. "During your observation," she said, "did you see this individual at any of the 9 positions?" Reese looked at the photograph. The face was male, late 40s, with the kind of features that didn't attract attention, the specific unremarkability of someone who had possibly spent years cultivating not being memorable. There was something in the eyes, though, a quality of assessment, the look of a person who was always calculating. She thought about the 9th shooter, the one who had broken from protocol, the one who had counter-hunted, the one who had moved to a position she hadn't mapped and had almost found her before she found him first. She had not seen his face. She had seen his behavior, his decision-making, his tactical creativity. "No," she said, "I didn't see this individual." But the 9th shooter, the one who broke from standard protocol and counter-hunted, his decision-making profile matched what I'd expect from someone who designed the network rather than simply executed within it. Ms. Chen's expression didn't change, but something shifted in her attention, a fractional increase in the quality of her focus. "Say more about that," she said. "The other 8 followed the protocols the system was designed around," Reese said. "Standard counter-sniper relocations, standard coverage patterns, standard mutual observation arrangements. They executed the design. The 9th one improvised within it. He understood the design from the inside, not as someone following instructions, but as someone who understood the reasoning behind the instructions. When the standard protocols failed, he created new responses in real time." She paused. "That's the behavior of a designer, not an operator." Ms. Chen looked at her for a long moment. Then she said something that changed the shape of everything. "The individual in that photograph is a former intelligence officer. He designed protective security systems for 14 years before his credentials were revoked, following an investigation that produced inconclusive findings." She picked up the photograph. "We have reason to believe he's been contracting those same design skills to non-state actors for the past 3 years. Varek was the 4th known client." She looked at Reese directly. "If what you're describing about the 9th shooter is accurate, and I believe it is, then we may have had him in the field last night." The room was very quiet. Marsh leaned forward. "You're saying the designer was personally on site?" "We're saying it's possible," Ms. Chen said, "which changes the calculus significantly because if he was there, we have a very different question than we had 24 hours ago." The different question hung in the room without being stated, and everyone in the room who was paying attention understood what it was. The 9th shooter had counter-hunted Reese. The ninth shooter had broken from protocol, improvised in real time, moved to an unidentified position, and had come within a very narrow margin of finding her before she found him. If the ninth shooter was the designer, the person who had built the system that had protected Varek and three other clients before him, then Reese hadn't just neutralized a network. She had eliminated the architect. She sat with that. Not with triumph, not with satisfaction in any simple sense. With the specific weight of a person who understood that what sounded like a clean outcome on its surface had more texture than that. Because the architect being dead meant the information he carried was also gone. And in intelligence work, dead was not always the most valuable outcome. You needed him alive, she said. Ms. Chen looked at her with something that might on a different face have been called approval. We needed him, Ms. Chen said. Alive was preferable, but the ninth shooter was aiming at you. I know, Reese said. Then there was no decision to make. I know that too, Reese said. I'm just telling you what it costs. The room sat with Ristat for a moment. Briggs uncrossed his arms and crossed them again, in the different way he did when he'd heard something that landed. Marsh looked at the table for a second, then back up. Whitfield, who had been watching Reese throughout the debrief with the focused attention of someone who understood what they were witnessing, said nothing. It was Davies who broke the silence, which was unusual for Davies, who generally waited to be addressed. The documents we recovered, he said, and he looked at Ms. Chen rather than at Reese. If the ninth shooter was who we think he was, the documentation he would have had access to is potentially in that compound, Ms. Chen finished, which is why I'm on a plane back to the recovery site in 4 hours. She looked around the table. The mission last night opened a door we have been trying to find for 18 months. What's behind that door is bigger than Varek, bigger than the network. She paused. How much bigger is what I'm going to spend the next several weeks finding out? Another silence. Then Marsh looked at Reese. You saved 16 lives last night, he said, and you may have just cracked something that the intelligence community has been working on for a year and a half. He paused. I want you to know, whatever comes next from the debrief and the follow-on investigation, what you and Garrett did out there is something I am going to spend the rest of my career trying to find the right words for. Reese looked at him. The right words, she said, are that Dylan needs a good orthopedic surgeon and about 3 weeks of rest. Marsh almost smiled. Already in process. And the 16 men who went into that compound last night. All present and accounted for, Marsh said. Every one. She nodded. There it was. Not the revelation about the designer. Not the intelligence door that had been cracked open. Not the thing that Ms. Chen was already building a follow-on operation around. Those were real and they mattered, and they would unfold over the coming weeks and months in ways that Reese might or might not be part of. But 16 men had gone into a valley, and 16 men had come back. That was the number that Reese Callahan carried out of the debrief room and into the gray pre-dawn light of Phoebe Mercer, where she stood for a moment with the cold on her face and the weight of 36 hours still sitting in every muscle and joint, and thought about the distance between what the world could have looked like this morning and what it actually looked like. A bomb maker in custody, a defensive network dismantled, a door opened into something much larger, and 23 names on a casualty report that would not be joined by 16 more. She was still standing there when Briggs came out and stood beside her in the way he had stood beside Marsh the night she walked away from the operations center with her equipment pack and disappeared into the dark. You holding up? He asked. Thinking, she said. He nodded. You want company or quiet? She considered. Quiet, she said. But you can stay. He understood the distinction. He stood beside her and was quiet. The base around them was coming alive with the morning activity of a forward operating post. The sounds of shift changes of equipment being moved, of people doing the 1,000 ordinary things that constituted life in a place that was also a war. Somewhere on the base, Dylan was in the medical bay, probably arguing with the doctors about something, probably losing the argument, probably doing it anyway. Somewhere in a secure facility, Omar Varek was beginning to understand that his mountains hadn't protected him. And somewhere in the document recovery from the compound, in the papers and drives and records that Ms. Chen was flying back to examine, was the beginning of a thread that would lead somewhere larger and darker and more complicated than any of them fully understood yet. Reese stood in the gray morning light and breathed. The mission was over. Everything else was just beginning. Sergeant Major Briggs stayed beside her for 11 minutes without saying a word. That was the thing about Briggs that Reese had come to understand over the years. He had an almost preternatural ability to read what a person needed and then simply provide it without announcement or negotiation. Most people, when they stood beside someone in silence, couldn't help eventually filling the silence with something. A word, a question, a comment about the weather or the bass or the coffee. Briggs never did. He just stood there fully present, fully attentive, and let the silence be exactly what it was. At the end of the 11 minutes without turning her head, Reese said, "You knew I could do it." Briggs didn't answer immediately. Then, "I thought you could do it. There's a difference." "What's the difference?" "Knowing is certainty," he said. "Certainty doesn't require trust. What I had was trust, which is the harder thing. Trust means you accept the possibility that you might be wrong and you commit anyway." She thought about that. "Did you tell Marsh that?" she asked. "Something like it," Briggs said. "He got there on his own eventually." She nodded slowly. The base was fully alive around them now, the gray pre-dawn having shifted into the low flat light of early morning. Somewhere across the compound, she could hear the sound of rotors, another helicopter. Different from the extraction bird, probably a logistics run or a personnel rotation. The ordinary machinery of a forward operating post, continuing its ordinary work regardless of what had happened in the mountains the night before. That was the thing about the military that civilians sometimes didn't fully understand. The extraordinary and the ordinary coexisted without much drama. Last night, 9 people had been removed from the landscape between a compound and a team of 16 operators. This morning, someone was signing off on a fuel order, and someone else was arguing about breakfast rotation, and someone else was trying to fix a communication relay that had been giving intermittent errors for 2 weeks. The world didn't pause for what happened in those mountains. It just kept moving. "Get some rest," Briggs said. "I need to check on Dylan first." "Dylan is sedated," Briggs said. "They're addressing the leg. He'll be out for at least 6 hours." A pause. "Which means there is nothing you can do for him right now except sleep so that when he wakes up, you're actually functional instead of pretending to be." It was the most words she had ever heard him say at one time about a non-tactical subject. She looked at him. He raised an eyebrow very slightly. "Go to sleep, Callahan." She went to sleep. It was not an easy sleep, which was what she had expected. The body was exhausted in ways that should have produced immediate unconsciousness, but the mind operated on its own timeline, and Reese's mind had too much unresolved content to simply shut down. She moved through the first hour in a half state, not awake, not fully under, drifting between the image of Position 9's movement and the number 42 minutes in Ms. Chen's face when Reese had described the ninth shooter's decision-making profile. The designer. That was what her mind kept returning to, because she had been in that firing position. She had found him in that notch in the rock. She had made the calculation and pulled the trigger, and the ninth shot had resolved the ninth problem, and the valley had gone still. That was the operational fact. That was what the debrief documented and what the after-action report would reflect. But somewhere in the quiet of almost sleep, she was sitting with the other version of it. The version where the ninth shooter had found her first. The version where the timing had been slightly different, where she had taken 1 extra second to confirm her calculation, or where Dylan's position had shifted fractionally and caught the ninth shooter's attention before she was ready. The margin had been real. She was honest enough with herself to know that. And in the honesty of that acknowledgement, there was something that Frank Bishop had tried to teach her that she hadn't fully understood until this particular morning. He had said it in the context of a training evolution years ago when she had been a younger shooter with excellent technical ability and somewhat less wisdom about what excellent technical ability actually meant in the real world. He had said, "The shooter who survives long enough to become experienced is not always the best shooter. Sometimes they're the luckiest. The difference between skill and luck is often invisible from the outside. What matters is that you stay humble enough to know you can't always tell which one it was." She had thought she understood that. She understood it better now. Not because the luck component had been large. She genuinely believed the calculation had been right. The position choice had been correct. The execution had been sound. But because there was a version of the ninth shot where some single variable she hadn't controlled had been different, and in that version, the conversation at FOB, Mercer this morning had a different shape entirely. She filed it. Not as fear, not as doubt, as information. as the specific kind of knowledge about one's own limits that made a person better at what they did rather than worse, because the people who scared her were not the ones who knew their limits. It was the ones who didn't. Sleep arrived sometime around the second hour. She slept for 4.5 hours, which was less than she needed and more than she had expected. When she woke up, she lay still for a moment in the practiced way of someone accustomed to environments where the act of waking up required a brief assessment before movement. She was at FOB Mercer. The mission was over. Dylan was in the medical bay. She got up, cleaned up, ate something that tasted like nothing and was probably nutritionally adequate, and walked to the medical bay. Dylan was awake. This surprised her. Briggs had said 6 hours, and she had slept only 4.5. But Dylan was propped up in the medical bay bed with the look of a man who had decided that the amount of time the anesthesia wanted to keep him unconscious was less than the amount he was personally willing to accept. His leg was wrapped and elevated, and there was a monitor attached to something she didn't examine too closely, and his face was pale with the specific pallor of someone managing post-surgical discomfort through sheer force of professional habit. He looked up when she came in. "You slept," he said. "You're supposed to be sedated for 6 hours," she said. "I was sedated for 4.5, he said. I convinced them that was sufficient. By doing what? By being correct about it. She pulled the chair beside his bed and sat down. She looked at him for a moment, at the exhaustion in his face, at the controlled quality of his discomfort, at the particular expression of a person who was more grateful to be sitting in a medical bay than they were going to say directly. "The leg," she said, "is going to be fine," he said. "They're talking about 6 to 8 weeks, which means 4 to 5 in real terms if I do the work." "You'll do the work?" "Obviously," he said. A comfortable quiet settled between them. It was the same quality of quiet from the night before departure outside Reese's quarters when Dylan had been reading his paperback and she had been looking at the stars. The kind of quiet that only existed between people who had been through enough together, that silence was a form of communication rather than an absence of it. After a moment, Dylan said, "The debrief. What did I miss?" She told him. "All of it, Miss Chen. The photograph. The analysis of the ninth shooter as a possible designer, the door that the compound intelligence had opened into something larger than anyone had fully understood when the mission started." Dylan listened without interrupting, which was how he always received complex information. His expression shifted once at the part about the ninth shooter potentially being the designer, and what it shifted into was a particular focused alertness that Reese associated with him processing something that had implications he was working through in real time. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "The ninth shooter was hunting you." "Yes. And if the profile is right, if he was the designer, then he would have known that someone had executed the first 8 positions systematically. He would have known he was dealing with someone at a very specific level." "Yes," Reese said. "Which means he wasn't just hunting you," Dylan said. "He was hunting you specifically. He knew what you were." She sat with that. "He knew someone had worked the sequence," she said. "That's different from knowing who." "Is it?" Dylan said. "Because the way you described his movement going to the unidentified position, covering the high probability zones for a relocated shooter, waiting rather than firing immediately to find both targets. That's not a response to a generic threat. That's a response to a specific type of threat. He knew you were a precision pair, and he tried to take both of you simultaneously." Reese looked at the floor for a moment. "He was good," she said. "The best one out there," Dylan said quietly. "And you beat him." She looked up. "We beat him." He accepted the correction without argument, which told her that he accepted it as accurate rather than as a courtesy. Then he looked at the ceiling for a moment and said, "The larger thing, whatever Ms. Chen is flying back to unpack. Are you going to be part of it?" "I don't know," Reese said honestly. "Do you want to be?" She thought about it. "I want the right outcome. Whether I'm part of it, specifically, that's a command decision." Dylan looked at her with the expression that meant he was going to say something that might land as a challenge, and that he had decided to say it anyway because it was true, and she had long since established that she preferred truth to comfortable silence. "That's the diplomatic answer," he said. "What's the real one?" She looked at him steadily. "The real one is that there's a thread that leads somewhere I don't have full visibility on, and the intelligence community is going to follow it, and I'm a precision shooter, not an intelligence officer. So yes, I want the right outcome, and no, I don't know what role I play in getting there, and I'm okay with that uncertainty. Dylan considered this. Fair, he said. And you need to focus on your leg, she added. My leg is fine. Your leg is in a sling. The sling is a precaution. She looked at the sling, then at him. He had the expression of a man who genuinely believed what he was saying, which was sometimes the most challenging version of Dylan to deal with, because his conviction was usually grounded in real assessment rather than wishful thinking, which meant arguing with it required actual counter-evidence. 4 to 5 weeks, she said, do the work. I always do the work, he said. Has there been a single instance in 3 years where I didn't do the work? She thought about it. No, she admitted. Then extend the same confidence to my recovery that you'd extend to my spotting. She almost smiled. That's a good argument. I know, he said without any performance of modesty about it. She stayed with him for another 40 minutes talking about nothing particularly significant, the kind of conversation that had nothing to do with operations or missions or the larger things unfolding in rooms they weren't in, just the ordinary back and forth of two people who were comfortable enough with each other to be genuinely ordinary when the extraordinary had passed. It was one of the things she valued most about their partnership, and she was aware of valuing it even as it was happening, which was unusual for her. She was not typically a person who lived in moments in the present tense. She lived in preparation and execution and assessment. The present was usually the place where she passed through on her way to the next thing. Today she let herself be in it. When she left the medical bay, Major Whitfield was waiting in the corridor. Not pacing, not leaning against the wall, standing with the contained stillness that characterized her general presence, holding a folder that she extended toward Reese when Reese was close enough to take it without either of them having to change their position. Reese took it. She looked at Whitfield. Orders, she said. Review board, Whitfield said. Scheduled for 72 hours from now. Standard protocol following an operation of this classification and scope. Reese nodded. She had expected it. An operation involving the elimination of 9 individuals, including a potential intelligence community affiliate, in a classified combat zone executed by a 2-person element operating outside the normal chain of command attachment that generated a review. That was appropriate. That was how it was supposed to work. Am I in any difficulty? She asked directly. No, Whitfield said, but I want you to understand what the board is actually going to be looking at. She paused in the way she paused when the next thing she said mattered. They're going to be looking at decision-making under novel conditions, at the adaptation from 7 to 9 targets, at the sequence change to prioritize gap positions, at the counter-hunting response for target 9. They are going to be looking at every decision you made that deviated from the original parameters. And Reese said, and my rate is that every deviation was correct, justified, and executed with the kind of judgment that the review board is going to want to understand rather than question. Whitfield looked at her steadily. But I want you to be prepared for a room full of people who are going to dissect decisions you made in fractions of seconds from comfortable chairs with unlimited time to think about it. Reese understood what she was being told. It wasn't a warning exactly, it was the kind of preparation that a good commanding officer gave a subordinate before something difficult. The advance information that allowed a person to enter a room with their eyes open rather than surprised. I made the right calls, Reese said. Not defensively, as a statement of fact. I know you did, Whitfield said. I need you to know it too. There was a distinction there that Whitfield was drawing deliberately, and Reese felt it. Knowing you made the right calls and knowing it in the way that survived a room full of questions from people who hadn't been there were two different things. Whitfield had been in enough review boards to understand the difference. I'll be ready, Reese said. Whitfield nodded. Then she said something that wasn't in the folder, wasn't in the orders, and wasn't the kind of thing she said often. What you did out there, she said, is going to be talked about for a long time, not just because of the tactical outcome, because of how you approach the entire thing, the preparation, the adaptation, the execution. People are going to study it. She paused. I want to make sure you hear that from me directly before the board, and the reports and whatever else comes next turns it into an institutional document. Reese held her gaze. She thought about the right response and then set aside the search for the right response and simply said what was true. I had 30 hours to prepare, she said, and a spotter who stayed completely still while the 9th shooter looked for him. Whatever gets studied, make sure Dylan's name is in every version of it. Whitfield's expression didn't change, but something behind it did. It will be, she said. They stood for another moment, then Whitfield turned and walked back toward the operations center, and Reese stood in the corridor with the folder in her hand and the weight of everything that was about to begin settling around her like the cold in those mountains had settled around her 48 hours ago, present real something to be carried rather than avoided. The review board was 72 hours away. Dylan's recovery was 4 to 5 weeks. Ms. Chen's investigation was already in motion, and somewhere in a secure facility, Omar Varek was beginning to understand the dimensions of what had happened to his operation. The external network dismantled the compound, captured the documentation, recovered the designer gone. However long it took him to put that picture together, the picture itself was not going to change. Reese walked to her quarters, sat on the edge of her bunk, and picked up the letter that was still on her small desk where she had left it before departure. Her sister's letter, the one with the drawing. She unfolded it, looked at the drawing again. Aunt Reese the soldier in crayon, with the anatomically creative interpretation of a 7-year-old who was completely confident in her vision. She sat with it for a long moment. Then she took out a piece of paper and started writing back. Not about the mission, not about any of it. She wrote about ordinary things, about the food at the base, about a colleague who had strong opinions about card games, about what she was looking forward to when her rotation ended, and she got to come home and eat something that hadn't been prepared in an industrial kitchen and sleep in a bed that had a real mattress. She wrote the way she always wrote to her sister, honestly, warmly, with the specific voice she used for her sister that was different from the voice she used for the rest of the world. Lighter. More like the person she was when nobody needed her to be anything professional. She wrote, "Tell Emma the drawing is on my desk. Tell her Aunt Reese the soldier is doing fine." She finished the letter. She folded it and set it aside to be sent in the morning rotation. Then she lay back on the bunk and looked at the ceiling and let herself think about something she had been putting off thinking about since the helicopter lifted off from the extraction point. Frank Bishop. He didn't know any of this had happened. He was in Tennessee, retired, living the life of a man who had done enough and earned the right to stop doing it. He wasn't in any intelligence network that would route this information to him. He was just a retired Marine living in Tennessee who had spent 7 years turning a young shooter into something exceptional and had then stepped back and let her be that thing without monitoring it or taking credit for it. She owed him a phone call, not because of the operation specifically. She would never be able to tell him the details of the operation classification and security and all the ordinary walls that existed between what happened out here and what was available to people who no longer held clearances. But she owed him the phone call because of what she had understood this morning during those 4.5 hours of not quite sleep about luck and skill and the distance between them and about what it meant to carry the things your teachers gave you into situations they never specifically prepared you for. She had been thinking for a year about what she would say to him if she called. She knew now. She would tell him, "What you taught me worked when I needed it most." And I don't mean the technique, though. The technique was right. I mean the part that isn't technique. The part about staying calm when everything around you is falling apart, about assuming the enemy is as good as you and beating them anyway, about the difference between confidence and arrogance and accuracy. The part that lives in me now, not as memory, but as instinct. That part worked. In the worst version of a situation I've been in, it worked. She would tell him that. She planned to call him the day she got back stateside. The review board convened 71 hours after Reese left the quarter outside the medical bay. It was not a comfortable room. That was something Whitfield had not exaggerated. 7 people around a table, 6 of them male, most of them considerably senior to Reese in rank, all of them with documents that contained an account of the last 4 days assembled from the debrief transcripts. Dylan's notebook records, the communications logs, and the intelligence that Ms. Chen's team had begun processing from the compound documents. They knew more in some ways than Reese herself knew about certain aspects of what had happened. The intelligence picture that the recovered documents were building had been partially assembled in the 71 hours since the debrief, and some of that picture had made it into the review board file. The 9th shooter had been identified with high confidence. His name was in the documents, and the identification matched the profile in the photograph that Ms. Chen had placed on the table. The designer had been in the field. He had counter-hunted Reese. She had eliminated him. The board worked through the tactical decisions in the order they appeared in the record. The adaptation from 7 to 9 targets, the sequence reversal to address gap positions first, the repositioning during the Western Cluster sequence, the counter-hunting response for Target 9. For each decision, they asked the same essential question in different words. Why did you deviate from the original plan? And what was your assessment of the risk at the time of the deviation? Reese answered each question the same way, directly, completely, without hedging and without inflation. She described the information she had had, the calculations she had made, the alternatives she had considered and rejected, and the reasoning that had produced the choice she made. She didn't perform certainty she hadn't felt. She didn't perform doubt she hadn't felt either. She described the decisions the way they had actually happened in the compressed high-information environment of real-time execution under conditions that didn't allow for extended deliberation. The hardest question came from the most senior board member, a brigadier general named Holloway, who had the manner of someone who had developed his questions over many years of conducting exactly this kind of review. He asked, "At what point during the execution did you believe there was a significant probability that you would not complete the mission?" Reese thought about it honestly. "When Dylan told me Target 9 had moved to an unidentified position," she said. "Up to that point, the deviations from the plan were within a range I had anticipated and prepared for. When 9 moved out of the mapped positions, I was working without the foundation I'd spent 30 hours building. That was the first moment where the outcome was genuinely uncertain, rather than just difficult." Holloway looked at her. "And what did you do with that uncertainty?" "I used what I had," she said. "I used Dylan's last known observation. I used the geometry of the terrain and what I knew about how someone with the designer's profile would think about position selection. I made the best calculation I could with incomplete information, and I executed it. And if that calculation had been wrong, then I would have been wrong," she said. "I understood that was the risk. There's no version of that moment where the risk wasn't real." Holloway sat back slightly. He had the expression of a man who had heard many answers to that question and had learned to recognize the difference between an honest one and a constructed one. He said nothing further on that point. The board continued. 2 hours and 40 minutes after it began, it concluded. Reese was asked to wait outside while the board deliberated, which took 12 minutes. Then she was called back in. Holloway spoke for the board. He said, "The decisions made during this operation, including all deviations from the original parameters, are assessed as operationally sound, tactically justified, and executed with a level of judgment that reflects exceptional professional capability. This board finds no impropriety and no violations of rules of engagement or operational protocol." He paused. "This board also finds that the outcome of this operation, including the intelligence value of the compound documentation and the identification of the network's designer, represents a significant contribution to ongoing efforts in this theater." Another pause. "Staff Sergeant Callahan, do you have anything to add to the record?" She thought about it. Then she said, "The outcome belongs to the team. Corporal Garrett's spotting throughout the operation was exceptional and was directly responsible for the success of the most critical elements of the execution. The SEAL team executed the assault with precision and professionalism that made the compound exploitation possible. The intelligence work done before the operation by Captain Davies and his team gave me the foundation I needed. Whatever is added to the record should include all of that." Holloway looked at her for a moment. Then he said, "So noted." 3 weeks later, Dylan walked out of the medical bay on his own. 4 weeks, not 5. He had done the work with the focused intensity he brought to everything, refusing to treat recovery as something that happened to him rather than something he controlled, working the physical therapy with the same precision he brought to calculating ballistic data in mountain terrain. Reese was waiting outside the medical bay when he emerged. She handed him a coffee. He took it and drank some and said, 4 weeks. "I see that," she said. "I said 4 to 5. "You said 4 to 5 to me," she corrected. "To yourself, you said 4. He considered this. "Probably," he admitted. They walked together through the base in the way they had walked together through a lot of places over the years, not in any particular hurry, not performing anything for anyone. Just two people who worked well together, being in the same space without requiring it to be more than that. After a while, Dylan said, "Miss Chen's investigation. It's moving." She had heard. The compound documents had produced what the intelligence community was apparently describing internally as a significant advancement in understanding the structure of the network that had contracted the designer over the previous 3 years. Names, locations, relationships, the kind of intelligence map that took years to build and sometimes cracked open in unexpected ways from a single operation that broke the right thing at the right point in the structure. I heard, she said. There's going to be follow-on operations, he said. Probably. We might be attached. Possibly. He looked at her sideways. You're being deliberately non-committal. I'm being accurately non-committal, she said. We don't have orders. When we have orders, we'll discuss it. And in the meantime, she looked out at the base around them, the ordinary continuing life of the place that had been the backdrop for the most demanding 72 hours of her professional career, and that was now simply the place where they lived and worked while they waited for whatever came next. In the meantime, she said, I need to call Frank Bishop. Dylan glanced at her. He knew who Frank Bishop was, knew him the way you knew the foundational people in someone's story without having met them through years of accumulated reference and context. He had never asked why she didn't call him more often, and she had never explained it, and that was the kind of thing their partnership absorbed without comment. Okay, he said. She made the call that evening alone in her quarters, sitting on the edge of her bunk, with the crayon drawing on the desk beside her. The phone rang 3 times. Then, Frank Bishop's voice, older than she remembered it, or maybe not older, maybe just different from how she carried it in memory, warmer in its ordinary register than the training voice she had been hearing in her head for years. Callahan, he said, because he had her number in his phone despite everything. Bishop, she said. A brief pause, then, You okay? I'm fine, she said. I wanted to tell you something. Go ahead, she told him. Not the details, she couldn't give him the details, but she told him the shape of it. The preparation, the moment with the 9th shooter, the things she had understood during that not quite sleep about luck and skill in the distance between them. And the things she had been planning to say to him for a year. She told him what you taught me worked when I needed it most. She told him all of it. When she finished, there was a silence on the other end that lasted long enough that she checked the connection. Then Bishop said in a voice that was the most unguarded she had ever heard him use, I taught you the framework. You built what went inside it. Don't give me more credit than I earned. You earned it, she said. Some of it, he said. Another silence. Then he said, you staying safe out there. I'm trying, she said. Try harder, he said. And there was something in it, not levity, exactly, not gravity exactly, but the specific mixture of both that characterized the way Frank Bishop had always talked to her, the particular frequency that meant I am serious about this, and I know you know I'm serious, and we both know this is how we express it. I will, she said. They talked for another 20 minutes about nothing particularly significant. His retirement, her sister, the general state of the world, as seen from Tennessee and as seen from a forward operating base in Afghanistan. The ordinary conversation of 2 people who were glad to be talking. When she hung up, she sat for a moment in the quiet of her quarters. She looked at the crayon drawing, Sergeant Reese the soldier. She thought about the 23 names on the casualty report. She thought about 16 men who had walked down into a valley and walked back out. She thought about Dylan in the medical bay saying 9 in the voice that was the most human she had ever heard him sound. She thought about the designer in the notch in the rock and the 14 seconds it had taken her to find him and the shot that had ended the sequence and opened the valley and changed the shape of something much larger than any of them had fully understood when it started. She did not think of herself as a hero. She never had, and she understood now more clearly than she had before this particular operation why that was. Heroes were a story people told after the fact to make sense of outcomes that were actually the product of preparation and discipline and partnership and the specific courage of ordinary people doing extraordinary things, not because they were fearless, but because the alternative, the valley full of men with no one to clear their path, was something they refused to accept. That was what she had done. She had refused to accept the alternative, everything else, the 9 shots, the 42 minutes. The review board's assessment, the intelligence door cracked open. In the compound documents was the result of that refusal expressed through years of preparation and 3 years of partnership and 7 years of someone else's teaching. All of it arriving at a single moment in the dark on a mountain where one woman and one spotter decided together that the thing everyone said was impossible was simply a problem that hadn't been solved yet. She stood up. She folded her sister's letter with the drawing inside it carefully, the way you folded something you were going to carry with you, and she put it in the inside pocket of her jacket where it had been since she left for the mountains, and where it would stay until she got home. She turned off the light. And Staff Sergeant Reese Callahan, the woman the mission was built around, the woman who had looked at an impossible problem and asked only how much time she had lay down in the dark and slept the clean, complete sleep of someone who had done exactly what they came to do and brought every single person home alive.